Hello and welcome to Insights Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. My name is Martin Farr, I'm co-chair of the programme. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our latest online virtual lecture given by Xeon Lights entitled Why Geographers Need to Stand Up for the Planet, and it is our annual Tyneside Geographical Society Lecture. I shall return at about 6 o'clock after the lecture for a Q&A session with our speaker. So if you'd like to ask her a question or make some comments, please do so in the chat box on YouTube. And you can comment on the lecture and engage in public debate. On Twitter, our hashtag is @InsightsNCL. And the introducer for this evening's lecture is my colleague in geography, senior lecturer and chair of the Tyneside Geographical Society, Dr. Rob Shaw.
Hello, my name is Dr. Robert Shaw, and on behalf of Geography at Newcastle University, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Tyneside Geographical Society Lecture as part of the Insights Public Lecture Series. Before we begin, I'd like to take the chance to remind you about the history of this lecture and the unique circumstances under which we're recording it in 2021. The Tyneside Geographical Society was established in 1887, 40 years before the academic study of geography here in Newcastle. Its founders were local businessmen, and early talks explored themes to help the city's merchants, governors, importers and exporters better exploit the market position that the British Empire bought them to further Newcastle's expansion. The society was successful and eventually established ownership of the now demolished Lowvane Hall on St Mary's Place, which today forms part of the campus of Northumbria University. It continued to attract visitors and speakers from far and wide, though through the early 20th century, its talk shifted towards tales of exploration, including visits from almost all of the major Antarctic and Arctic explorers, including Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton. With the founding of the Department of Geography at Newcastle University in 1927, the society changed again, and the speakers in the 1930s reflected an increased presence of academic geographers rather than explorers. During the Second World War, the society lost revenue through its closure, and it was eventually wound up, with its assets transferred to the university. But in 1955, the first lecture under the name of the Tyneside Geographical Society was hosted by the university, and this year's is the 57th version of that lecture, reflecting its status as a more or less annual event in geography at the university since then. One of the years missed since 1955 was, of course, 2020, when today's speaker was originally booked to present. Xeon's talk last year was scheduled for the 17th of March, which ended up being the day after the university officially ended all in-person teaching and meetings, although we had taken the decision to cancel the talk about a week or so earlier. The lecture last year thus fell into that window after COVID-19 cancellations had started, but before we were all familiar with the move to online events that this last year has seen. Speaking in April 2021, we can hopefully look forward to the possibility of events such as this taking place in person in the not too distant future. But right now, the TGS takes its own step unimaginable to its founders nearly 140 years ago, into the world of video conferencing. And we're delighted today to have Xeon Lights with us as today's speaker. Xeon is an eco-activist, author and science communicator. She's written the evidence-based book, The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting, the nature poetry book, Only a Moment, and the forthcoming Zero Waste Kids with Rob Greenfield. In 2019, she was a coordinator in Extinction Rebellion's UK's media and messaging team, and she founded its newspaper, The Hourglass. More recently, she's left XR and taken up the position as a director of Environmental Progress UK, a campaign group who seeks to put nuclear power as part of the greening of Britain's energy creation. The title of Xeon's talk, Why Geographers Need to Stand Up for the Planet, encourages us as geographers to think not just about how we research and talk about sustainability, the environment and geography, but also how we apply that understanding to make meaningful changes in the face of the ecological crisis. I just think today's talk really speaks to the Tyneside Geographical Society's long-standing interest in presenting both geographical thought and how it can impact upon society, but also bringing people in to help us think about how geographical knowledge can be best used to support change in the world. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Hello, my name is Xeon, and I am an environmental activist and journalist. I have over the years attended many debates, written in national newspapers, and appeared on television all over the world to talk about climate change and climate solutions. My involvement in the green movement goes back a long way. Here I am taking part in a direct action to protest tar sands extraction. I was part of a small activist group called Camp for Climate Action, which took direct action on a different environmental issue every year. In these photos, you can see that we closed and blockaded banks that were investing in tar sands across Edinburgh during the Fringe Festival in 2010. Climate Camp never really took off, but it used quite similar tactics to Extinction Rebellion today. It eventually disappeared. I continued to attend protests such as anti-nuclear protests pictured here in 2009. Although I'm not a geographer, I care very deeply about this planet and all of the life on it. That's my biggest motivation. I first approached climate action by advocating that people live with less. This sort of thing, reducing personal emissions and being anti-nuclear, they're very common when you're in the environmental movement. They're sort of standard positions that no one really questions, and I certainly didn't for many years. In fact, I authored a book on how to lower your carbon footprint using evidence. I'd read a lot of green parenting books when I had my first daughter, and I didn't like that they were full of misinformation. For example, they tended to be against vaccinations, they tended to promote homeopathy and essential oils in place of medication. And so I wrote this book with a chapter in it on vaccines and just explaining the science behind vaccines. As a result, I received hate mail. I upset green editors I'd previously written for who said that I could never write for them again. And it was such a strong reaction that I realized I needed to learn to communicate the evidence better in a better way to really reach these people. So I went back to university and I studied for a master's in science communication. I wanted to learn how to talk to these people better. Now, climate change has worried me since I was a child. We have known about climate change for decades. When I was at school, we called it global warming. I went on the climate wave in London in 2009 to demand climate action, and it really felt like things were going to happen. Thousands of people attended, we all wore blue and marched together, but nothing happened. In fact, for some time, nothing really changed. But of course, the climate continued to change. Over the past 12,000 years, the Earth's climate has been remarkably stable. Then we began to burn fossil fuels. Now, don't get me wrong, good things came of that. They enabled us to have a high quality of life, but they also, of course, had a negative impact on the planet. The average surface temperature of our planet has now risen by around 1 degree since pre-industrial times. Now, in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, was founded. This is a large body of scientists who volunteer their time to review the science relating to climate change. Since the 80s, the IPCC has published 5 key reports detailing that science. So why have we been so slow to take action? I've been talking about climate change for years, but I found that it wasn't being taken seriously. I even wrote an article for the Huffington Post called "Can We Talk About the C Word Yet?" referring to climate change. And now we know that it's not that surprising that the issue sort of dropped out of public consciousness, just as I found at my talks that there were so many people in the audience who would claim that science had gotten it wrong, that climate change wasn't really happening, that it wasn't human driven. We now know that the fossil fuel industry spent billions on funding climate denial. That's what happened. It completely left the agenda for a long time. Then something else happened. Extinction Rebellion was formed, and around the same time, Fridays for the Future as well. These are environmental movements that blocked roads, took to the streets en masse, and called for climate action. In the spring of 2019, I helped to close and hold Waterloo Bridge in London, which made headlines around the world. It led to the widespread adoption of the term climate emergency. It led to worldwide net zero goals. Blocking roads in order to cause disruption put climate back on the agenda. But now that it's back and people remain concerned about it, where do we go from here? What are the solutions? Environmentalists and protest groups in general are good at protesting against what they don't want, and that often has good results. It has worked across Europe where nuclear power plants have been shut down thanks to Greenpeace and other groups holding anti-nuclear protests. It has worked to gain India independence. It has worked for civil rights and so many other large and small causes. Advocating for solutions is more difficult. The suffragettes did it by demanding that women had the right to vote. But it's rare. It's rare to advocate in favour of something. The founders of Extinction Rebellion stuck with that. They did the usual thing. They knew that what they were against, and they decided to stay away from discussing solutions, as the organisation believes that the current political system cannot fix a problem that it created. Extinction Rebellion's third demand therefore calls for a system change. But I worry that this focus on the system confuses political activism and social change with climate mitigation. Climate mitigation needs to be immediate and effective. If we fail to take action and stay below 2 degrees of warming, the situation we find ourselves in will be so dire, the planet will be in such a dire state. I can't imagine any new system of governance will even matter to us at this point. We're talking about severe scenarios of mass species decline, mass migration, severe drought, flooding, worsening storms, and so much more. So who is advocating for solutions? Now, unfortunately, most people don't have a high level of science literacy, and that includes politicians, world leaders, environmentalists, and activists. And yet it's imperative that climate action is evidence-led. We risk losing more time and potentially doing more harm than good if it's not evidence-led. I decided to comb through the existing data, and here's what I kept coming back to: energy. The biggest slice of the pie here is energy. This is where most of our emissions come from. And I looked at how much we use, and I realised how impossible it is for us to get to net zero through just reducing our personal emissions, something that I had been advocating for and written a book on. I learned that there are solutions. I learned that nuclear energy is in all of the IPCC's pathways for decarbonisation. I learned that there are options for bringing down our emissions, for weaning off of fossil fuels. But I had to do a difficult thing to accept this, something that was more difficult than blocking a bank or a road. I had to change my mind. I had to change my opinion, to admit that I had been wrong and to risk going against my tribe. And just like with the anti-vaccination attacks, I had attacks from anti-nuclear friends. But I realised that I'd fallen from scaremongering and conspiracy theories when it came to nuclear energy, and I didn't want to do that anymore. The more I looked at the data, the more I found that I had been wrong. This is Oxford University's research. It shows that nuclear power is just as safe as solar and wind power. It's in fact safer than hydropower. And this shows you very clearly what we need to wean off of, the fossil fuels. Now you might be wondering why this matters, why this is relevant. It really matters. Greens like myself believe these lies, and we protested against a clean, safe, non-carbon source of energy. The best example of this is what's happened in Germany. Greenpeace and other groups have heavily campaigned against nuclear power, and Germany decided to phase out all of their nuclear power fleet before coal. As a result, their emissions have skyrocketed. They burn lots of coal now. They have the dirtiest energy mix in Europe. France, on this same map, you can see it did the alternative. France didn't succumb to the misinformation. In the 1970s, they wanted energy independence. They didn't want to rely on oil imports so much anymore. So they built lots of nuclear power stations, and now they have one of the cleanest energy mixes in Europe today. So what I learned was that the problems with nuclear power are not technological, but political, and that actually the groups that I had belonged to and been active in have dominated the narrative on what constitutes clean energy, what gets subsidized and built and what doesn't. When actually it should have been scientists, it shouldn't have been the scientific consensus making those decisions. Now let's put this into context. Why does nuclear matter at all? I wouldn't be talking to you about nuclear now if I didn't care about climate change. Let's be realistic about what we're afraid of. Let's even take climate change off the table for a second. Fossil fuels kill 8 million people alone from air pollution. Fossil fuels will also kill millions more through climate change. But these 8 million deaths today are preventable. They are preventable. We should be rallying to wean off of fossil fuels. And yet, when you talk about energy, all you hear is the negative arguments against nuclear. What about renewables? Can't renewables do it? Well, I used to heavily advocate for renewables. I used to advocate for 100% renewables. Again, this is just a standard thing that you do when you're part of the green movement. then I came across this report. This is the report that many organizations, green organizations, use to back up their 100% renewable reality. And I realized that this report requires a 60% reduction in energy. And it baffles me because in 2 decades of activism, I've not found a way to get people to lower their carbon footprints by anywhere near 60%. And I wrote an entire book on how to lower your carbon footprint. Behavioral science has not found a way to do this either. Now, the good news is that we don't have to. We can meet our energy needs by replacing fossil fuels with clean energy. We can bring down our emissions and we can maintain a high quality of life. That's what the data shows us. That is the scientific consensus. 15 years ago, I argued that battery storage to make renewables scalable was just around the corner, and I still hear people argue that today. But I argue now that we don't have time to wait to turn more corners, wishing on a new technology that doesn't yet exist, when we have existing technology that can meet the demands easily. We need dispatchable clean energy to support renewables, to keep our lights on and our homes warm when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. When solar capacity drops, when solar generation drops, as shown by this chart, then the backup is currently coal, gas, or biomass. Biomass requires mass burning of forests and shouldn't be considered green. But the alternative to fossil fuel backup is blackouts. If we don't have the fossil fuels and we don't want nuclear, what are we going to do? We're going to experience blackouts. This is something that we don't even think about because we are very lucky that we are energy rich. We are energy rich individuals living in wealthy nations. We never have to think about running out of power. We just turn on the light and it works. We cook our food. It's easy. We never have to think about what it would be like to live in a world without abundant energy. The UK, in order to do this, burns about 60% gas, 12% nuclear, and coal on days when the solar or wind generation drops. You can check the current energy mix any day by going to electricitymap.org, and you can see the scenarios of coal taking over when the solar and wind drops. The IPCC scenarios for decarbonisation by Working Group 3 show the need for about 50% nuclear in the energy mix. Current plans for new nuclear in the UK are non-existent. We are not going to meet our 2050 net zero target. And when we realise this in 2050, we will have left it too late to act. Now I want to talk about social justice, because this should be a key tenet of environmentalism, but it usually barely gets mentioned. A professor called Mark Jacobson made a plan to get the whole world to run on 100% renewable energy. This is recent, more recent than the CAT report. And environmentalists, again, are celebrating this. Even though his plan states that Indian citizens should only have 1/5 as much energy as Americans. Also, when the numbers in his paper were found to be dubious, i.e. they didn't add up, Jacobson tried to sue the scientists who had tested the numbers and found them wanting. He then dropped the case. We in the West drove climate change through burning a vast amount of fossil fuels in order to develop and attain a high quality of life for ourselves and our children. We don't have to worry about the things that people live in energy poor countries. Now, developing countries need vast amounts of energy to lift themselves out of poverty, and they're asking to burn coal. And environmental NGOs and governments are telling them not to, but we don't want them to invest in nuclear, and we don't want them to have fossil fuels either. And let's be honest, intermittent renewable energy is not going to allow them to develop the way that we did. How are they going to develop a high quality of life? When I talk about poverty, I'm not just talking about not having money. I'm talking about lack of access to medication, healthcare, vaccines, lighting, fuel to warm your home with, and to cook food on. Energy poverty is real, and energy equality is real. We're very lucky that we don't really understand what they mean. There is a strong moral case for us to lower our emissions immediately to allow these countries some leeway to develop. These are the countries that will be hardest hit by climate change, like my family in the Punjab in India. They live in a little village, they rely on rice farming, and they're finding that it's already becoming more difficult due to water shortages caused by more frequent droughts. There's something almost obscene about how some of us in the wealthy developed world agonize over the prospect of potential societal collapse, while for 2 billion of our fellow humans, that is the reality that they live every single day. To talk of 100% renewable energy pathway that requires a 60% drop in energy consumption is an insult to these people. It is also an insult to all of those who have died from fossil fuel related air pollution who could have been saved by clean energy investment instead. We are so quick to laugh at flat earthers and anti-vaxxers, yet many of us have fallen for the same misinformation when it comes to energy and climate solutions. We are making decisions and believing in things that go against scientific consensus. For example, the EU. The European Union classes biomass as renewable, even though it requires mass clearing of forests, often in the Amazon. The EU also lumps nuclear with fossil fuels in its energy assessments against all of the evidence. In fact, there has been recent news on this, about the EU taxonomy. This is a classification system that establishes environmentally sustainable economic activities. So what's green and what isn't, basically. The European Commission's in-house scientific body, the Joint Research Centre, just released a report on nuclear power. And they said that it should qualify for a green label under the taxonomy. As of right now, nuclear is the only energy technology to receive a formal independent scientific assessment. So it's the only energy technology that should 100% be classed as green. It should be in the green taxonomy. The EU set this process, but instead of abiding by the result, it's now called for further reports. This taxonomy will have repercussions for what happens across Europe in terms of making policy decisions to bring down emissions. In the fight to address climate change, the goal should not be how do we get to 100% renewable energy. That should not be the end of the hypothesis. It should be how do we decarbonize in the most effective way with the tools that we have available to us. And we also need to do this with the smallest ecological impact, which means the smallest land footprint possible. This again means picking energy solutions that are dense, energy dense solutions like nuclear, which takes up the least space and is a reliable source of energy. We need to rewild the land and protect wild spaces. For example, peatlands are extremely important to our planet. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this. They cover around 3% of the world's land, but are the largest natural organic carbon store on land. Yet more than half of the wind turbines in Scotland are on highland peat. I know that it's an odd message for traditional environmentalists. Build more rather than live with less. But this is the reality of what the data is telling us, and we need to keep up with that. From the IPCC to the World Health Organization to the United Nations, the data all comes out the same. If we don't bring down rising emissions, the future looks really bleak. Millions of people have already died because of our misplaced fears. Countless species are going extinct already. It's not too late to act. But so far, the action that we need has not been there. It's not evidence-led. It's not in place. No one's really calling for it because no one seems to understand what the data says. And those few voices that do speak up, they don't tend to be heard. They don't tend to have a say in this the way that this traditional old school Greens do. I myself have been accused of working for industry. When I wrote my book and it had a chapter on vaccines, I was accused of being a big pharma shill. Now I tell people that renewable energy is in all of the IPCC's decarbonisation pathways, and I get called a big nuclear industry shill. I have no connection at all to industry. I do not work with industry. I've never taken money for industry. I'm a climate activist. I remain a climate activist. I'm also a science communicator, and it's imperative that this science is communicated. In 2018, a special report from the IPCC laid out the human cost of failing to limit heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The report showed that even though 1.5 degree of heating is not without risk, the impacts of 2 degrees are so much worse, catastrophically worse. But there's good news in the same reports. IPCC working groups 1 and 2, they tell us what's happening. Working group 3 shows us the different energy representative pathways. but we're not putting them into action. If we leave climate action to only a small group of environmentalists who often fear science and technology, we risk losing everything. On behalf of my daughters, Arwen and Raven, pictured here, I urge you to use your voice. People need to understand that there are solutions. These facts need to be communicated effectively and outside of insular academic circles. We need those of us who are science literate to come forward and educate others about mitigation solutions, about the positive future we can achieve if we follow the science now, about the lives that will be saved, and about the climate justice issues. We need you to influence policymakers. We need you to write letters and articles, to do talks, to ensure that climate action is evidence-led. We need you to defend peatlands, to reach out to the EU Parliament, to write in local papers, to write in national papers. Most of all, we need you to take the steps that you need to develop the confidence to speak about climate action, because if you don't, that space will be occupied with people who have the confidence, but who promote pseudoscience. I urge you not to sit this one out. My daughters love this book, The Lorax. We read it regularly. It's about a little yellow creature that says it speaks for the trees. It's a really important environmental message for children and for adults. But I'm going to make a small amendment to this here, because I know that you, like me, already care about the planet. So let's replace that word care with communicate. Unless someone like you communicates an awful lot, it's not going to get better. It's not. Thank you.
And we're here live with our speaker. Zion, welcome to Insights.
Hello, Martin. Thanks for having me.
That was a remarkably clear and measured presentation. Very, very interesting for the layperson like myself. It made me wonder very much from the outset whether what you found in terms of your former confrères, your former friends who've come around to be critical of you, do they vary in their background? Do they suspect your motives in any way? What's it been like?
I have found that actually. So I've been doing lots of talks on this topic, very similar to what you've seen, but I kind of tailor it to the audience. And I have found actually it tends to be older generation climate activists, environmental activists who have a lot of hang-ups about nuclear and a lot of fears. And also when I get attacked, it's always those groups. Whereas when I've been speaking to university students, I've spoken to several universities now, all they have is questions, and they're quite easy to answer questions. And I think it's two reasons. One reason is they've grown up with the looming threat of climate change, and that's more important to them. Having solutions is more important to them, and they'll grasp if there are solutions because they want to see some kind of potential for a future. And I think the other reason is that they're very information savvy, this younger generation. And so if you give them a fact, they can go away and look it up, and especially the students. And I've given them some sources when they ask me questions, and I said, you can just go away and look at the data, because they don't have the emotional hang-ups that a lot of the older generation have. It's actually quite easy to communicate the science to them.
And of course, they haven't got a memory of the Cold War, of nuclear annihilation, of Chernobyl, which must help as well.
Exactly. And so much of this kind of anti-nuclear sentiment is fed by those feelings, whereas the younger people have those feelings about the threat of climate change and their futures.
And I suppose you probably dreaded that highly regarded drama series about Chernobyl, bringing back to square one, introducing a new generation of people to that moment in time when sheep were being infected in Wales and so on. But the technology is so much more advanced, it's not really possible or helpful to compare things with then, I assume.
It's really not, but you know, again, it goes back to that data that when there have been some disasters, it's still not on anywhere near on a scale compared with what we're actually using most of the time, which is fossil fuels. And we really have to look, when you think about risk perception, you always have to, you know, compare it to other things. Otherwise, if you didn't do that, you would never get in a car, right? If you look at the risk of having an accident or losing your life from driving, you would never get in a car. Actually, what do people fear most? They don't fear getting in their car, they fear flying. Actually, statistically, you're so unlikely to be harmed flying, much more likely to be harmed in your car. But our risk perception isn't very good. Humans aren't very good at it, actually. And you can see the same thing now with the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's very, you know, it happens everywhere. It's really important in science communication. We talk about risk communication a lot, and you know, thinking about how we fix these issues. And I could go into the kind of evolutionary biology, which is the reason that we have these kind of emotional responses, and we're not always very good at being rational. But I would be digressing, but it would be a whole other lecture. But what I would say is that with climate change, and with the deaths from air pollution because of fossil fuels, you've got to look at it in that chart that I've shown in my talk, which is the most dangerous, which do we need to absolutely wean off of right now, you know, not right now, a decade ago, save lives. And it's very clear, the science is very clear.
Do you, I mean, you present a very clear evidence-based case here, but do people suspect your motive? Do they call you out and assume you've been nobbled by somebody in some way?
All the time, maybe every day on Twitter. The worst insult I think was I was called a turncoat shill, which was interesting for someone who has been arrested multiple times for climate action, authored an entire book on how to live with a lower carbon footprint using evidence, given hundreds of talks globally. I have been doing this, you know, Greta was a baby when I started doing this. I've been out on the streets, I've been in the squatted tents with Climate Camp in the early 2000s. There's photos if you dig hard enough online. It hasn't changed, and that why would that change? All of those things are still true. I've realized actually we made a mistake. I made a mistake 15 years ago when I was protesting against clean energy, because actually if we'd been building that then, we wouldn't be in this dire predicament that we're in now.
Are there others like you? A strange question to ask. I mean, do you feel like you're a lone voice, or are there increasing numbers of activists who realise the case you're making?
No, not at all. There are many actually, but I don't think they have a strong or powerful a voice, or they're not given a voice way that anti-nuclear activists are. And I've actually recently started providing that voice, and I've even kind of been criticised on this, where I saw I think it was Jonathan Porritt actually just the other day who wrote, you know, who are these people? Why have they been duped into believing in nuclear? Again, it's that old generation type thing, you know. And there's me in the comments saying you just need to step out of the way. You're doing damage at this point. We need to get our emissions down. But it's interesting because I really want to appeal to those people, but I've dealt with this kind of anti-science sentiment before with vaccine communications, which I was doing years ago, and which was also in my book. And there's always, I mean, the researchers found this is always a small group that for them, that belief is like a fundamental religious belief, and you will not be able to change their mind. So really you just have to identify who's in that group and then just step away. So I've been trying to do that, but you know, even my media, I've managed, and it's really hard to get the media because journalists will often be kind of anti-nuclear, or they won't know enough about it, won't feel confident enough about it to write about it. And I went to the Telegraph newspaper and I said, all of your articles, I wrote up a list and I said, look at these articles that are all anti-nuclear. Do you realize you're doing this? And they said, no, we're being fair, we're being balanced. And I said, no, you're not, because this is wrong and that's right. And they genuinely hadn't realized. And they, on the back of that, after many conversations, the editor let me write a piece on why we need nuclear energy in the UK, why it needs to be part of the net zero goals. And then Jonathan Porritt and lots of other old Greens said, why are they giving her this voice? How is she getting in there? But actually, I'm just providing balance to a debate that has been dominated by anti-science, anti-nuclear views for so long. And you think about, you say I've made that case that for the evidence, actually, it's so appealing, and it's really important that gets out there. If people hear that and they still disagree, fine, no one's going to say or do anything to you, that's fine, you can go on your way. But most people it does appeal to them, so we do have to reach them. And I think actually journalism should play a big role in that, and has been part of my task for the last year, is just trying to get journalists to understand that reporting misinformation, and we can't do it anymore. It's dangerous, and it kills people.
Do you think, curiously, that the pandemic will assist you? I mean, there are anti-vaxxers and so on, but the pandemic and the overcoming of the pandemic with the vaccine has demonstrated arguably the triumph of science. May that actually make us more evidence-based in our reporting and discussion of these things?
Well, I'm afraid I have a more pessimistic view than you. I think we desperately need more science communicators. This is what my appeal was in the talk. Any academics out there, we desperately need you, because actually, if you go on my Twitter right now and you look at a post that I made, it was only a meme, it was only a little joke, but it was a pro-vaccine meme, and it was trying to say, look, AstraZeneca's not that bad. Stop worrying about it. It had about 1,000 likes or something, and if you look in the comments, all of those attacks about pharma paying me and why is she shilling for vaccinations. So that sentiment is still really powerful, and they're not all bots. I know people dismiss it and say they're bots. They're not. This is arguably the biggest challenge of this era. Right now, we're in this massive boom of all the information. We've got everything at our fingertips. We've got this crisis. We've got crises that we need to deal with in an evidence-based way, and then we've got this gaping gap in the middle where there isn't enough communication. And actually, some of the best communicators are the people who are against science, which is why you get big rallies against COVID and things like that happening, because they have good communicators behind them. And I think that's going to get worse, in fact, and we desperately need to challenge it, because it's not going to go away on its own.
Now, you mentioned the different generations and recollections of disasters, but nevertheless, these persist. And Michelle, one of our viewers, asks, my fears around nuclear power centre around the chemical pollutants as well, and well-documented nuclear accidents. How would you suggest we change public opinion about this source of power?
So on the accidents front, I think I kind of covered that in the talk, that, we tend to think that it's so much worse than they are. We have all the fear to do with it, but actually, if you look at the toll, it's not as significant, anywhere near as significant as with fossil fuels. It's right down there with solar and wind. It's actually safer than hydropower. On the issue about chemicals, everything requires those. All construction projects, especially large construction projects, use vast amounts of chemicals. We do need to make sure that it's regulated and done well. The nuclear industry is extremely well regulated, which is why it can be very slow to build new reactors, at least in this country, because they're so well regulated. What I would say, though, is that this, again, this kind of framing, people don't even always realize they're doing it, but it is kind of this fear of, well, nuclear's got all of these problems, but did you know that coal ash is actually more radioactive than nuclear waste? I bet you've never heard anyone say, oh, what are they doing about fossil fuel waste? Is that even a term? Do people say that, fossil fuel waste? Yes, it creates waste, and it's very dangerous and very harmful. Is it well managed? Is it well regulated? I honestly don't even know. This is not a discussion that we seem to be having, even though we know that fossil fuels are the things that we need to wean off of. In terms of public opinion, this is what I'm trying to do. I think we desperately need more communicators. We desperately need more people to understand the really basics of the science and get the word out there. And actually, it's not as easy as that, because it's a fight, just like with vaccines, and GMOs and other things that I've talks on. You're coming up against a big load of misinformation, and that's hard. It also means that anytime you provide some balance, or you provide a comment contrary, or provide any evidence, you're doing an extremely good and valuable job. And I just can't say that enough.
A related question comes from one of our viewers on YouTube, who asks about a specific example. What do you think about Fukushima's plan of pouring nuclear wastewater into the Pacific Ocean?
I think it's a great plan. I would drink that water. So the reason that people are worried, or were worried about that, is because contains tritium. So the water has been treated, so it doesn't contain anything dangerous in it. It's highly regulated. It does contain tritium, and that's what all of these news articles were about a week ago. I saw lots of reporting on this, some really good reporting and some was somewhat irresponsible. The tritium exists naturally, just like radiation. It exists naturally in nature, it exists naturally in our bodies. It's about how much are you receiving? How much of that are you, being externally, well, actually that water is tested. It's a seventh below the standards that the World Health Organization permits in water. So arguably you could be drinking other water that has more tritium in it, but you wouldn't think about it because you're not going to read an article linking it to nuclear waste, probably. I hope that I've dispelled that concern anyway, but I would urge you to again look up somewhere, reputable, like Scientific American, or somewhere with good data, rather than some of the really awful journalistic pieces that I heard with all kinds of random scaremongering about something that we really shouldn't be worried about. It's not dangerous, and I would happily drink that water.
How does I'm just curious, how does the BBC report this? Because I know lots of climate skeptics are very critical of Roger Harrobin and their accusation that he's actually a campaigner on behalf of green causes. Do you think BBC is a fair arbiter in this process?
So I think this is interesting, actually, because when I got into this space, the first thing I did, I have a very strong media background, so I kind of looked at the different newspapers and I wanted to see who's reporting what and how fair is it. And the BBC actually, they were more fair than, for example, The Guardian, which is just, surely they're breaking journalistic standards with some of their articles. That's all I'm going to say about that. With the BBC, I thought it was much more fair, although I found that they just wasn't very much reporting. I was really happy to see that Justin Rowlatt, who is a brilliant reporter anyway, he's been in the climate scene for decades now, he wrote a really good piece on radiation, which is that it has that fact about coal ash in it, about how it's more radioactive. And I thought that was such a good and in-depth, thorough piece. I'd urge anyone to go and look it up. He's a brilliant reporter on it. And I actually did kind of get in touch and I wanted to say well done. And he said, actually, lots of people seem to be emailing me saying this. And I said, because there's a lot of us out there who are climate activists, but with a science background. We want evidence-based change. There are some journalists who are trying really hard in this space. And I said to him, I really hope you'll write, more about this issue more. And he just sort of said, well, it's up to his editor, that he would be happy to, because he understands that it's a really important issue and that it's not being discussed widely. So, on that point, if you do write, you have to think about these organizations. They get a lot of anti-nuclear people writing in. So when I started Extinction Rebellion, one of the things we did was we went to the BBC, we blockaded the entrance, and we said, hey, why are you platforming climate deniers? You should not be having debates between climate deniers and climate scientists. And that was what was happening at the time before Extinction Rebellion was founded. That was only about Exile was only about 3 years old. So when we had, then people went in, I wasn't in those meetings, but this Media Tell the Truth team went in and had conversations with them and got them to understand that they shouldn't be doing that. And our argument was kind of, you wouldn't have a doctor and then someone who says that, you don't have organs in your body, right? You wouldn't have that. So why have you got climate scientists? And they heard that. They need to do that. For all science, right? And there is room for debate within these issues, but you can't have just an anti-nuclear activist and then like a nuclear physicist. It just doesn't make sense. And at the moment, that's where we're at. So when lots of people write in these letters, we do respond, editors respond, and writers are kind of told what they can and can't write about. So if you write into your paper and you say, will you write something on nuclear? I'm just interested, and it would be great, because we need more coverage of it. If you look at the ratio, the amount of content on renewables compared to nuclear is just astounding. And yet, if you look at the IPCC data, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's very clear that we need huge amounts of nuclear and comparatively much less renewables. We do need lots of renewables, but comparatively much less. I could give you the percentages, but they're quite boring, frankly. But anyone can look them up. They're in the IPCC report.
Do our leaders, our representatives, feel cowed by this debate? Are there many MPs, for example, who are confident in making the case you are?
I think, yes, first of all, absolutely, they feel cowed. I've spoken directly to these people and I know that. Secondly, I think there is this problem of science literacy. Now, my master's in science communication, one of the first things they teach you is, look, if you're in this room, you already have above average science literacy. Like, the levels of science literacy are generally quite low. That's not because of our country or anything like that. It's just fairly standard among people. So actually, you look at politicians' backgrounds. How many scientists, how many politicians can you think of that have a scientific background? Actually, mostly they don't. And I really think that a lot of them are science illiterate. And so you have people like Greta saying, you need to listen to the science, go and listen to the science. And I actually think, for example, our government, maybe they are trying to do it. They're just not very good at doing it. But something in science, something in a search engine, you're not going to get the right results. You need to have someone actually analysing the data, communicating the IPCC data and things like that. You know, it is very dense. Most people do find it a bit boring, you know, and then there's a next step, which is communicating it and making it policy. And I just think we're kind of lacking the smarts in that area, which again is why we need scientists and academics who are able to do that, to help fill that gap and to push for change, whether it's writing to MP and saying, are you standing for this? This is what the data says, and I've never heard you comment on it. Or the only time I heard you comment on it was about some random thing about Fukushima water, which, by the way, there was a point I should have made there, which is that is always how that water is disposed of. It's not a new thing. It's just that the newspapers decided to have a heyday with it all of a sudden. And you know, people often try and say Fukushima as this kind of anti-nuclear argument. Japan is building more reactors, and they're really fast. They've just built some in just 3 years, which is much quicker than we manage over here.
On the subject of dissemination and information, we have a question from one of our viewers, Mark, who asks that you mention that members of the Green Movement have got it wrong on nuclear power. Do you think that organisations such as Extinction Rebellion can sometimes be harmful in spreading misinformation?
Well, I mean, this is exactly where I make a comment that I just get attacked on. But yes, sadly, and I've been part of those groups. And actually, I've been part of these groups for long enough that when I joined Extinction Rebellion, I understood that was a problem and I wanted to help to fix it. So when I authored my book, I wrote a book on green parenting. It's called The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting. And the reason I wrote that book is because I'd had a baby and I started reading the literature on, right, how do I maintain my low carbon footprint? I had a super low carbon footprint. I really wanted to maintain it. And all the books were just full of pseudoscience, just absolute wishy-washy woo. It was like use homeopathy, don't use a doctor. You know, and I was, you know, have your birth like this, and I'd be like, but is that right? Is that, you know, she's also said this about don't use it, is it safe? And so I started researching it, and because I started researching it, more and more people started asking me, and I started giving talks on it, and then I had a book deal, and so I said in this when I was approached by the publisher, I said I really have to have a chapter on vaccines. You know, it's not telling people what to do. None of the book is written like that. It's a communication of the evidence. Here's what the evidence says. After that book, I was attacked so heavily, and I think actually I was a bit naive because I know that the books that I'd been reading in that genre by those written for those parents was quite anti-vaccine. So the attacks that I had were just phenomenal. People accused me of working for big pharma, all kinds of stuff. I was deplatformed. This is before anyone was talking about cancel culture. It was terrible. There's a major green magazine that I'd written for free for years. I got in touch with the editor and said, would you consider reviewing my book? And she said, no, because you're shilling for vaccines. And I was really shocked and quite upset. So I knew that this was going to be an issue, right? I knew when I joined Extinction Rebellion that there were going to be those contentious issues. And actually quite a few of the founders I met are anti-vaccine as well. So I knew that on nuclear. But the problem that I had is that you're so kind of hemmed in with what you actually could talk about. So initially I started out talking about the severity of the climate crisis and how we need to act. And I think Extinction Rebellion did an amazing job at that. I was doing that work beforehand and it wasn't going anywhere. We came on the scene. We were only a few years old. We shut all of those locations in London. It wasn't our first action, but it's the first one that really kind of captured the moment. And I helped to take and hold Waterloo Bridge. It was a momentous moment. Put climate change on the agenda. That's it. No more climate denial. We're not doing that anymore. BBC is not going to have climate deniers on there. All of that stuff happened, and that's great. But now we've got to move that conversation along evidence-based solutions, and that's where they fall over. Because, for example, they have an XR rewilding group. When a friend of mine in XR tried to start an XR anti-nuclear group, he basically got told to leave. So that's the situation that we're in. Though that's what I'm saying about some of these people, you can't reach them. They will hold on to their views no matter what. But you know, we've got to stop them taking other people with them, and we've got to communicate to the rest of the people. Because actually, I find most people are very reasonable and responsive to data. It's just that they're not hearing these arguments anywhere. And my experience has been both in Extinction Rebellion and when I was a member of the Green Party, and I left the Green Party because they wouldn't let me discuss nuclear. And actually at that time, I would say that I was kind of on the fence and curious and asking questions. And even that was shut down. I was just told, no, we're anti. And so, yeah, you know, I'm hopeful that these things would change, but absolutely this misinformation has actually, I mean, let's be honest, stalled climate action. right? When I was out there protesting, that's what I did. Now I'm trying to undo that damage. I had some of these people reach out and they're really upset and they said, Zion, how could you? Why have you gone over to the other side? And I said, I haven't gone anywhere. I'm exactly the same person. If I save one nuclear reactor from closing in my lifetime, I will have actually made a real difference to the planet. I will actually have prevented emissions, that are driving catastrophic climate change. I may have been arrested and sat in cells. I may have written an entire book, may have stayed up all night meeting, writing deadlines about climate action. None of those things will have made a difference the way that it would make a difference if I saved one nuclear reactor from closing. So we'll continue to do it and fight the misinformation. And I really hope that these green groups finally learn to catch up and kind of, just do what they say they want to do, which is follow the science.
With your comment about going to the other side in mind, Robert has a question. You explored gaps between anti-science parts of the green movement and pro-science acceptance of nuclear. Is this too much of a binary? Is our choice really so divided, he asks?
I'm afraid so, yes. I mean, let's talk about where the anti-nuclear movement came from. It came from groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. That's where it came from. These groups have been around for a long time and they have kind of created and led the dialogue around climate change and climate action. And ask yourself if that's done any good. Our emissions continue to go up. We're closing reactors that have been giving us clean energy. We're refusing to build new ones. We're still just hoping, placing our bets on renewables, which, as I say, we were doing decades ago. Millions has been funded. Renewables have been funded with lots of money, billions, right? That's what Germany has done. If 15 years ago, you couldn't say that. I was making the argument that, if a country just did this, we'd have a solution. Now you look at the facts and you see that Germany has the dirtiest carbon footprint of Europe. You've just got to reassess. And actually, the second you do it, you get sidelined and you get told that you're not welcome. And it's a really hard thing. It's really hard to be in that space, which is why I say I know lots of people who are privately pro-nuclear, but they would never say it. And I'm trying to help to make it more normal and create a space where it is safe to say it, the same way I did when I was a young parent and I wanted to talk about vaccines. And a lot of my friends were kind of either vaccine hesitant or anti, or even the ones that kind of did want to, they did it secretly. It shouldn't be the case, and these groups that are actually, they exist to do good things, they need to get back to those roots of being able to do that. And I understand that they have massive stakes. Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth were founded with these. Friends of the Earth specifically was founded to be anti-nuclear, although they're more ambivalent now. Greenpeace, they've been really active in these spaces. And, it's very similar with the anti-vaccine ideology, because the second you challenge it, it's like you hurt them in their feelings, you hurt them in their gut, and you get rejected, and you have to leave spaces. And actually, if you don't believe this, there's a debate between me and a philosophy professor who's a long-term, old school green, Rupert Reed, and I did this debate with Essex University, and it was absolutely horrendous. And it's online, you can go and look it up and see sort of the way that we are treated when we say that we are pro-nuclear. And you can see that there is a big divide between people on this side and people on that side. And I'm sorry to draw that line, but I draw it because I recognize it and it has been my experience.
I'm always struck and impressed by people like yourself who put your head above the parapet, and the kind of criticism you receive. Is it more hostile on social media than it would be in a public meeting? Has it been an uncomfortable experience for you? And also your daughters and so on, are they aware of this type of exposure that you have?
Is it always hostile? Well, the debate that I've just mentioned was probably the most hostile environment I've ever been in. It's just a really, really difficult debate. So, if you promote any view strongly and you gain any platform, I think you get attacked. I think that's fairly normal, because when I was in Extinction Rebellion talking about climate change, I was attacked by climate deniers. It actually got so bad at one point after I went on the Andrew Neil show, because it was so widely viewed and the clip they put online had millions of views. It never happened to me before. I'd never had that level of exposure. I had to shut my Twitter down for a few days because the sheer number of comments, and sad to say, some of them were quite nasty, some of them were racist. It was really quite shocking and horrible. And I had to take a few days out, and there was a death threat that had to be looked into, and I was due to speak at the Rebellion in Trafalgar Square, and I decided not to go because I do have little children. I need to think about that. And I kind of took a step back, and all of that was because I was communicating climate science. You know, I was not, and actually if you watch that show, and he grills me on this number that I refuse to defend, I don't defend fake numbers, and I pretty much, you know, upset everybody by doing that, because I upset XR because I didn't defend the claim about billions of deaths, and I upset everybody else because I it looked like I didn't know what I was talking about, because I kind of was trying to tread a middle line where I didn't go against Extinction Rebellion's official, you know, statement on that, and they stand by that billions of deaths again now as well, and I really don't think they should. Yeah, you know, it's a hard space to occupy, but someone's got to do it. As for my children, 7 and 9, they don't have a huge awareness. I mean, they're not on social media yet, thank goodness. When I get asked to do documentaries and things, been asked to do a few this year, I tend to keep them out of it. I'm trying to protect them. It has got to the point, because I've been a writer for so long, that if they pick up a newspaper and I'm not in it, they just kind of cast it aside. Mummy's not in this one, because they're so used to me being everywhere, and I'm very active locally as well in my local community, so I am sort of everywhere. They are growing up with a high level of science literacy, so they're going to be okay, you know. And I think actually, no, yeah, it's challenging, yeah, it's hard, but I mean, that's life, right? You know, not to get too philosophical, but we all have challenge in life, and if you're doing it for intrinsic reasons, which is what I'm doing it for, which is that I want a better future for my children, I want a better future for my family in the Punjab, and it's fine. I sleep well at night. I'm doing the right thing, I think.
We have a final question, which I've been saving up, a very big question from our viewer Keres, who asks, do you think it is valid to be concerned about nuclear because of its potential to simply replace fossil fuels as fueling a growth economy, which is inherently ecologically destructive, whereas renewables might encourage scaling back?
Well, so first of all, the thing is, we are very energy rich. And even though my parents migrated here in the 60s from a poor country, from a poor part of India, from the Punjab, a little village in the Punjab, even though that happened, I didn't really have an understanding until I went there. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that, because we all know that poverty exists. But when I saw how poor they were and how little they lived with, I realized they're energy poor and we're energy rich. And they want nothing more than to be energy rich, which is why my parents left their homeland to come and work in factories here in Britain when they were offered jobs, because they were desperate for their kids not to have live that lifestyle of trying to find fuel, you know, trying to find wood to burn, so that you can cook food twice a day, trying to buy when it's dark, you know, it gets dark, you just go indoors and you turn the lights out, and that's it. You don't have any lighting. You're lucky if you have resources like we had. They don't just want lighting. They want what we have. They want things like laptops, you know. So I kind of think you have to be really careful with this discussion, because I don't think we have a right to say that to them, unless we want to go and live over there. And I tell you what, no one wants to do that. There's only once I was in this village, which my parents took me to, which took 4 hours to get there from nearest airport. This was before I flying. This was like my late teens, and took me to this little village, and it was 4 hours from the nearest city that had a hospital, right? And then we're in this village, and they have venomous snakes. And you know what? If you look up the statistics for people that die from snake bites, they're really high. They're hundreds of thousands in India. You know why? It's not because we don't have anti-venom, because we do. It's because they don't have access. Don't have access to the hospitals, and in the village don't have access, don't have education. I remember laughing at my mum when she was packing her suitcase, and I said, we're going for weeks, you can't just fill it with rubbish. And she said, no, I need to take these things. And it was things like pencils and paper. And then I got over there and I went, wow, kids didn't know how to hold a pencil. Let's be honest, this is what poverty looks like. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to live that reality. Actually, we desperately need some development. We need to lift out of poverty, and now they're talking about want to burn coal. That's what we did. We burned lots of coal, didn't we? Lots of cheap, abundant fossil fuels. That's how we developed to have a high quality of life. And a high quality of life, I mean, you know, clean water, access to medication, access to hospitals, all of that stuff. I covered a little bit in this talk, I know. I just can't emphasize it enough. We will not get that with just some power, which is intermittent. And actually, if you give them lots of intermittent power, going to end up using the backup that's fossil fuels anyway. That's always traditionally what has happened. And I wish that I could give you a scenario where that's not the case, but it's never happened in terms of decarbonisation. So I think, we have to be very careful about what we're saying we do or don't want these developing countries to do. They desperately, in Extinction Rebellion, I was very critical of this when I was part of Extinction Rebellion, which was this worrying about societal collapse and apocalyptic scenarios. People already live that way. You already live that way. And a few solar panels, no, I'm sorry, that's not going to cut it. That's not a morally wrong argument. What they do need is as much help as they can to leapfrog through from whatever fuels they need, the cleanest, right? That's really what they need. And if we think about aid, we could be thinking about aid for energy and energy justice. And it's sad to me that you never hear environmentalists talk about energy justice, because it's all about scaling back. And I have a very low carbon footprint, much lower before I had kids. I was in the papers for having such a low carbon footprint. And I authored an entire book on how to have a lower carbon footprint. We could all live that way, right? We could all give up our cars. I've never had a car, I never learned to drive. And it was when I looked at the numbers that I realized that scaling back, it would still be so insignificant. We'd still end up needing lots of energy just for ordinary everyday use, like heating and using washing machines and lighting. We are energy rich. We don't have to think about it. That's the truth. And we also, need to, yes, we do need to stop constant economic development and all of that. And that's a whole other discussion. It's unrealistic to think that we can get by with intermittent renewables alone. And if it was possible, there'd be good data on it. It isn't. And we've had decades to look for that data. The best scenario we have is a combination of nuclear and renewables, which means we get fossil fuels out of the mix. Let's get them out of the mix. Maybe something better comes along later. That would be great. Maybe everyone will be happy with some new energy source that's invented. We don't have time for wait for that right now. We need to get down our emissions. And that's not just to save the planet and to give the kids a future. The moral obligation at this point, because some countries are suffering the consequences right now, like my family in the Punjab, who are rice farmers, requires a lot of water, already experiencing drought there. I mean, come on, these people aren't, and they're already talking about migrating. Where are they going to go? A UN report says that 40% of India won't have access to water by 2030, I think it was. We need to bring down our emissions, and we need to stop this kind of idea that we can all just live with less. We can all try to do that. The numbers won't add up in terms of how little energy we'd be allowed to use to get to a net zero emissions. It would just be so little. We wouldn't be able to live like that, and actually people wouldn't want to, and that's the way that my cousins have to live at the moment in India. And I would love to see a scenario where climate activists came to recognize this, and they really understand what energy justice is and how it could make a difference in the world if we started addressing issues with that right at the forefront, because that's the difference. They are energy rich, they are energy poor, and we are energy rich.
A resounding end to a compelling presentation. Zion Latz, thank you very much on behalf of Insights and our audience.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching. Our next event will be Thursday, the 6th of May, where Dr. Carmen Hubbard will speak on Brexit and agriculture. What's next for British farmers? We hope you can join us then.